Klobuchar's words were, again, the definition of a monopoly. Is that your view as well?
Absolutely. Ticketmaster Live Nation has demonstrated that it's a monopoly. It's used its market power to cut off the airstream to rivals. It's raised costs significantly. You could see in the eyes of senators like Senator Blackburn, her outrage at the substantial fees she has to pay just to get a ticket. Remember, the service that's being delivered here is just moving information and money. And for that, all consumers are paying a really stiff fee.
Well, let's go back here, David, because, I mean, we talk about a combination that is more than a decade old, right? I mean, I think this deal happened back in 2010. We know that the Justice Department was all over them, basically to try to get them to sort of make some changes, and changes that, my general understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, David, that they violated, at least as per the settlement.
Right. Well, the Justice Department made the initial mistake. They should have just said no. This was a deal that was clearly anti-competitive, that raised significant risks of higher costs to consumers. But they decided to try a more risky course. And that gamble is a gamble consumers are paying for every day. And what's right here is for the Justice Department to go back into court and go and break up Ticketmaster and Live Nation.
Well, that's what I'm wondering. What can actually be done? I mean, so your viewpoint is that they should actually sort of force a divorce here. Is that likely? Is there precedent for that?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, some of the most important antitrust actions that have been brought, like the AT&T case, involve divestiture. And here, the elements necessary to require divestiture are crystal clear. They have exercised market power. They've charged consumers more. They've engaged in exclusionary tactics to really prevent ticketing alternatives from gaining a foothold.
When we talk about, though, sort of rolling back of what has already happened, David, there's always a question here of sort of what fills the void. I mean, you can sort of break up the company into different pieces. But what's the net effect? What does the net effect end up being for the consumer? Even though you may have two companies instead of one or three instead of one here, does that by default mean that's going to be better for consumers?
Oh, I think absolutely. And there was a compelling case made in the hearing. For example, ticketing alternatives like SeatGeek told a very good story about how it would be able to be a more effective competitor had Ticketmaster not secured all the key venues. The concert promoters said they could do a much more aggressive job and promote concerts more effectively if they weren't faced with a monopoly Ticketmaster. So on both sides of the equation, there would be a significant growth in competition because of the breakup of Ticketmaster and Live Nation.
What could Ticketmaster do at this point to sort of avoid a forced divorce? Are there any steps that they could take to alleviate the situation on their own?
It would be pretty hard. They could basically separate the interests of the two companies more clearly. The evidence is clear-cut. They coerce concert venues to use Ticketmaster, and in doing so, they cut off the ability of ticketing alternatives to effectively compete. They cut off the ability of concert promoters like Mr. Mickelson from Chicago, who testified, by basically controlling the access to tickets. So they could just separate the two companies, but that's basically the same thing as a divestiture.
I mean, you spent a lot of years at DOJ, the FTC. I mean, you know how this process goes, both in terms of in the courtroom as well as just in the halls of these buildings themselves, in terms of crafting regulations and crafting a case. The fight, the pushback that you're going to get from these companies in any of these situations here, David, as I'm sure you know, is enormous. And so I'm wondering, what is the political capital right now that you're seeing in Washington with this current administration and his current leadership that he has in some of these key agencies that they're willing to expend to continue these fights, not just against Ticketmaster, but of course against the Microsofts of the world, Alphabets, et cetera?
Well, Senator Blumenthal had a great point. He said Ticketmaster has done something that's basically humanly unimaginable. It has united Republicans and Democrats on the same side of a single issue. They're both really upset by the anti-competitive conduct of Ticketmaster. So I think the political capital is really high there, and Congress acted in the last session to significantly increase the budget of the Antitrust Division and the FTC. That would be money well spent going after Ticketmaster and breaking it up.